Russia attacked Ukraine with missiles and drones, killing at least 15 people. On Thursday, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt shared President Donald Trump's reaction.
He was not happy about this news, but he was also not surprised. These are two countries that have been at war for a very long time. The president wants it to end, but the leaders of these two countries need it to end and want it to end, must want it to end as well. And I think the president will make some additional statements on this later.
Considering the British Council in Kyiv was also hit in the attack, the European Union was not pleased either. In fact, President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, didn't mince words.
I'm outraged by the attack on Kyiv, also hitting our EU offices. This was the deadliest drone and missile attack on the capital since July.
Von der Leyen also announced that the EU will come with further sanctions against Russia soon. She also pledged to fast-track the use of frozen Russian assets to fuel Ukraine's rebuilding efforts. In addition to all this, a Russian official threatened to, quote, march on Paris. This came after the French president called Russian President Vladimir Putin an ogre, and Putin did not take it kindly. The Kremlin came out saying that France is now public enemy number one. Let's just pray these tensions don't explode. Turning stateside, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC, has seen a bit of turmoil in the last week. Trump fired the CDC's director. This then resulted in several other senior officials resigning. Protesters and CDC staffers are rallying behind those who walked out, hailing their exits as a defiant stand against the Trump administration. But the White House isn't backing down.
She was not aligned with the president's mission to make America healthy again. And the secretary asked her to resign. She said she would, and then she said she wouldn't, so the president fired her.
A Trump official confirmed that Jim O'Neill, the current Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services, is stepping up as the CDC's new acting chief. His first task, navigating this political storm. Now, from government to education, watchdogs have called out teachers' unions for funneling $40 million into left-wing groups since 2022. The American Federation of Teachers and the National Education Association are the two largest unions. They're also the two most guilty. So, what kind of progressive groups have they been funneling money into? It ranges from former Vice President Kamala Harris's failed 2024 presidential campaign to activist groups promoting abortion, so-called racial equity, gun restrictions, and more. This information was discovered through investigations from researchers at Defending Education, a right-leaning watchdog organization. As one researcher put it, this is insulting for American families and teachers who want student outcomes to be improved, not used as a tool to fund left-wing politics. Speaking of progressive agendas, a Christian medical professional was thrown into a legal battle after she was fired by the University of Michigan in 2021. Valerie Klusterman, a 17-year veteran with a spotless record, was fired from her job after she requested a religious exemption. She didn't want to be forced to refer patients for sex change procedures or use transgender pronouns. The hospital's response? They branded her evil and a liar and showed her the door for refusing to bow to their LGBT policies. Klusterman fought back with a lawsuit alleging that she was wrongfully terminated. Initially, a lower court dismissed her case, but in a unanimous ruling, a federal appeals court has just revived it. Now, Klusterman may have another shot at justice. And those are today's headlines. I'm Sarah Holliday. Dive deeper with the Washington Stand at WashingtonStand.com. Up next, we have Washington Watch with guest host Casey Harper. We're back Monday with more stories that matter.
From the heart of our nation's capital in Washington, D.C., bringing compelling interviews and insightful analysis, taking you beyond the headlines and sound bites into conversations with our nation's leaders and newsmakers, all from a biblical worldview. Sitting in for Tony is today's host, Casey Harper.
The President Trump approach of upholding law and order by letting our brave men and women in blue actually do their jobs to aggressively fight crime works. In just a few weeks, President Trump has done more for D.C. residents than Democrats did in 50 years.
That was Carolyn Leavitt, White House press secretary, talking about President Donald Trump's crackdown on D.C. crime. Now, some lawmakers are talking about extending the police takeover for as much as 6 months. And President Trump has said he's open to sending the National Guard to Chicago and Baltimore. We're going to talk about that soon. But first, welcome to Washington Watch. I'm your guest host, Casey Harper, filling in today. We have a great show for you. The D.C. crime crackdown that we mentioned is working. And now even D.C.'s Democratic mayor, Muriel Bowser, is admitting it.
The difference between this period, this 20-day period of this federal surge and last year represents a 87% reduction in carjackings in Washington, D.C.
87%, it's a big number, but should that be extended to Chicago or Baltimore or other cities? That's a different question. It's a difficult one, and we're going to talk about it soon. Meanwhile, a physician assistant was fired from her job for refusing to submit to the pronoun police. Now she's taking the hospital to court, and we have her lawyer here later in the show to explain how in the world something like this could happen, and could it happen to you? And we'll take another dive into the tragic news out of Minneapolis, where a trans shooter killed 2 kids, wounded 14 more, as well as 3 adults at a Catholic church during Mass. You know, that terrible attack, it makes you want to pray. It makes your heart go out to those families, to the victims. But the leftists are angry about that. They don't want you to pray. Here's Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey after the shooting.
Don't just say this is about thoughts and prayers right now. These kids were literally praying. It was the first week of school. They were in a church.
Jim Psaki, she chimed in too on X, saying, prayer is not enough. Enough with the thoughts and prayers. Okay, our Vice President J.D. Vance shot back on X, though, and he gave her a reality check. He said, we pray because our hearts are broken, you know? And we're going to dive into why the left is upset about this and just prayer in general instead of the real causes of these shootings. You know, the shooting does make you wonder how much of this is mental health, how much of it is spiritual. Of course, we are in a spiritual battle. Well, we have a guest today to talk about that very question. But first, as I mentioned at the top of the program, President Trump's crime crackdown on D.C. is working. Republican members of Congress, they've proposed several pieces of legislation to help him out, to even extend that 30 days of control to as much as 6 months. They're back in session next week, but will they extend that control before the September 10th deadline? Joining me now to discuss this and more is Congressman Jim Baird. He serves on the 3 House committees, including the Foreign Affairs Committee, and he represents the 4th Congressional District of Indiana. Congressman, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Thank you. Appreciate you being.
Of course. So before we dive into the D.C. crime crackdown, which I'm very interested in, I do want to get your thoughts on this tragic shooting Wednesday in Minneapolis.
You know, it's always heartbreaking to see little kids, 8 and 11-year-olds, and then actually killed, and then several others wounded. Your heart goes out to those families, and we certainly want to support them and support them with prayer and support them with any other means that we can to help them get through this difficult period. But it's just a senseless situation. And you mentioned earlier that it really gets into the mental health situation. Mm-hmm. That we need to recognize that we need to provide opportunities for people to have the kind of help they need to get through the not doing or make them stop doing that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. I think you're right about that. It's an unsolved problem so far. I don't think we talk enough about it. You mentioned the prayer. What do you make of this kind of backlash from so many on the left now against prayer? I don't think it's, prayer and action are not mutually exclusive, and often the former fuels the latter. What do you make of this?
Well, I think prayers do work, and I think that if you can't understand that and realize that God's there for you to share whatever you would like with Him, but He's always there, and prayers do work.
Well, I couldn't amen that more. And that's a good note to end on when we talk about that topic. And I do want to turn to what's going on in D.C. Of course, we're based here in D.C. We're seeing what's going on every day. And there's been some controversy, but what President Trump is doing with the National Guard and the federal agents is clearly working. Even the D.C. mayor admitted as much. And now we have a new AP poll, which found that the majority of Americans actually approve of what President Trump is doing, despite all the backlash and the loudness from the vocal minority. Are you surprised that he's got that support?
Not at all. I think many of us feel like that it's important to have a safe capital, and some of these other cities really need to be safe where they're enduring the killing and all the sort of homicides that are taking place. And then the police's hands are tied, so they can't really get involved or do anything about it to any major commitment. So,
yeah. Well, I think that we're seeing that, and the crime now has just gotten so bad that it begs the help, especially, President Trump mentioned Baltimore. I can't think of a city that I feel less safe in than Baltimore. And I've traveled around the world and been some, quote unquote, dangerous places. And honestly, Baltimore, just north of DC, has felt less safe than many of them. But at the same time, I feel this question of, at what point is it federal overreach to be sending, federal agents and the National Guard to these cities? So how do we think about this issue? We want to deal with crime. It's worked in D.C., but we also want to be wary of federal overreach. How do you think about that, Congressman?
Well, it's important. It's important that the criminal element sees that we are going to do something about them preying on our people in these various cities. And so sometimes you have to use significant force for them to get the message. And if we're not going to back up our police, then the next thing is to use the National Guard. And so we can still get the kind of enforcement that we need when we enforce our laws. And that makes them respect the community and be
right. Yeah, I think the respect is key. And it's interesting you mentioned enforcing the laws, because part of the problem here is so many Democratic mayors and Democratic governments, local, state, are just not enforcing the laws. Prosecutors aren't prosecuting. And so it's putting us in a difficult position where we might have to choose between sending federal agents to do something that really the local prosecutors and local governments should be doing. But it may be changing. The president's approach is working, and even California Governor Gavin Newsom, he may be copying him. So yesterday, Newsom announced a new plan. He's deploying California's highway patrol. He's calling them the crime suppression teams. He's sending them all over the state to prevent crime and promote public safety. It seems like Newsom is copying Trump a lot lately. So some Democrats aren't happy about what Trump is doing, and he's done in D.C. and other cities. But it seems like Newsom is copying him. How are Democrats supposed to react on this issue where Trump is kind of is winning?
Well, I have tremendous respect for our law enforcement and even our state troopers here in Indiana, as well as other states. And so when you have the backup that they need in order to do their job, that's extremely important. And, you wouldn't want to go out there and risk your life every day,
right,
if you didn't have the backup. And that's just like the military. When you got a commander in chief that will back you up, just like President Trump, then everyone recognizes how important that is. And you certainly wouldn't be willing to go as willing anyway, to go forward in a dangerous situation like that if you really didn't feel like you had the backup. And I think it's extremely important that we support our law enforcement. And this country is a country of laws, and we need to make sure that we can enforce that.
Yeah, it's got to be discouraging for these officers. And I've talked to some of them who say, I'm risking my life, I'm arresting people, and then the prosecutors aren't even prosecuting in many cases. Or, some of these guys, they know that if they go to a certain judge, they're just not going to get a conviction, no matter how much evidence they have, because some of the judges have become so politicized. So that's got to be, as you said, discouraging for law enforcement to risk their lives when the system is not backing them up.
I can't imagine, that catch and release kind of idea where you catch them for maybe with a lot of evidence, and then you take them to jail and they go through the process and they're back out on the street a short time later. And so that would be very frustrating to me, and I think it's very frustrating to law enforcement officers.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. So looking ahead, Congress is returning from August recess. You've got the NDAA, you've got border security. What should we look for coming out of Congress these next few weeks as you come back from recess?
Well, I think we got to keep the momentum going, and I think we've got to make sure that we pass. I'd like to see us pass all 12 appropriations bill as we move into the 26th fiscal year, and I think it's going to be opportunity for us to really fine tune and tweak our budget process. And by the way, the 25 cut out about $25 billion, and this 26 proposal, I think, is going to cut out another $45 billion. So we're interested in helping reduce the spending as well as making sure that we provide a sufficient funding for all those programs that are beneficial and really involve.
So you mentioned those cuts. Yeah, I'm glad you brought those up. Those were seen as a big win and a hard-fought win, but it sounds like you think there could be even more spending cuts coming even this year?
Well, this last time we focused on waste, fraud, and abuse. And so the DOJ folks uncovered and discovered things that we probably need to continue to look at and evaluate and make sure that we have sufficient and proper oversight.
Yeah, I want to get your reaction to one more topic on on defense and what's going on overseas. We have these new developments in the Russia-Ukraine war. Of course, President Trump met with Putin in Alaska, and they had these big meetings and different things. But then we haven't necessarily seen Putin changing his behavior yet. We've seen big strikes on Kiev that were some of the largest since the war began. What do you make of that? Should we give up hope on Russia, or do you think that there is still hope?
I'm not sure that there's always hope. You gotta pray for peace and so on. But when you look at Putin and what he's done and how many people that he sent into the battle that ended up as cannon fodder is amazing to me. And I don't support continuing that. They were the ones that attacked the Ukrainians. I do admire the Ukrainians for their willingness and ability to push back and last as long as no one probably thought going up against Russia that they would last this long, but they have. So I admire their commitment to and protect their country and move forward.
Yeah, it is admirable. And I think any of us would do the same, of course, if our country were at stake. It raises an interesting question of what is the U.S. role and how can we support them? There's a lot of questions about that. And it seems like, at least for now, President Trump's meeting with Putin has not yielded the results that many of us hope for, but it's not too late. Congressman Jim Barrett of Indiana, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, coming up, we are going to discuss where the two largest teachers unions in the country spent more than $40 million. And no, it has nothing to do with educating your kids. The money went to Democrats. Don't go away. You'll hear more about it. Stick around.
3 years ago, the Supreme Court issued its historic Dobbs decision, a ruling that overturned Roe v. Wade, which for nearly 50 years imposed abortion on demand, silencing voters and bypassing the democratic process across the country. The Dobbs decision was a huge step forward against abortion, but it didn't outright ban it. It returned the power to the people. Now, 29 states have laws on the books protecting life. However, there's a catch. Abortion numbers since Dobbs have actually gone up, with an increase of 12% since 2020, climbing from 930,000 to over 1 million in each of the most recent years. So how can this be? The answer is simple: the abortion drug. Today, over 60% of U.S. abortions involve abortion drugs, many of these without medical oversight. In 2021, the Biden administration quietly removed bare minimum long-standing safety protocols for the abortion drug that have existed for 20 years to protect women from life-threatening risks and ensuring informed consent. The Biden DOJ then declared that they would not enforce the Comstock Act, which prevents the mailing of anything that causes an abortion. This is not only illegal, but also dangerous. A study shows nearly 11% of women who take the abortion drug end up in the emergency room with serious complications. Unless the Trump administration reverses these reckless Biden-era policies, pro-life laws will remain largely symbolic. Without a full review and repeal of mifepristone, unborn lives will remain in grave danger and pregnant mothers will remain at risk. Let's stand for life and end this mail-order abortion drug pipeline. Sign the petition urging the Trump administration to take action at frc.org/stopchemicalabortion.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Family Research Council invites you to join our Stand on the Word Bible reading plan as we reflect upon the life of Jesus, the Word who dwelt among us. Come with us and discover the glory of the Word. Read the Gospels and witness the life-changing story of Jesus, his life, death, and resurrection. Come read how Jesus transformed the lives of common people and how those same people transformed the known world through the power of the Holy Spirit. Come with us for 10 to 15 minutes a day and read the entire New Testament before the new year. Find our Bible reading plan and daily devotionals from Tony Perkins at frc.org/Bible. Join us and stand on the Word.
Good afternoon. Welcome back to Washington Watch. I'm Casey Harper, your host for today. A new report that came out this week put an unwanted spotlight on the nation's two largest teachers' unions. That report came out from Defending Education, and it showed how the American Federation of Teachers and the National Education Association, those two unions, spent more than $40 million on far-left causes in just 2 years. That includes several massive payouts to Democratic political action committees during the 2024 election cycle. Imagine if all that money was spent, helping the education of our nation's children. They're not doing great if you haven't looked into it. Maybe that's too much to ask. I guess we'll find out. Joining me now to discuss this and more is Max Nelson. He's the Director of Research and Government Affairs at the Freedom Foundation. Max, welcome to Washington Watch.
Thanks for having me, Casey. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. So, I think when we see this number, $40 million, and it's not going, half to Republicans, half to Democrats. It's no secret that teachers unions give to Democrats. But can you unpack for us how they're getting such a large amount of money and where exactly is it going?
So the two major teachers unions in America today are the National Education Association, the NEA, and the American Federation of Teachers. And they have created an interesting business model for themselves. I think people tend to think of unions as somehow separate from businesses, but they really aren't. They have they're large corporate players with financial interests in increasing their revenue and their membership, just like any other industry. And so they have turned essentially a monopoly that they've secured on representing teachers in employment matters into a massive revenue stream that allows them to divert large sums of members' dues money into advancing a far-left worldview. And they do that by supporting extremely progressive political candidates, organizations, and causes. The Defending Ed report that came out this week, no offense meant to our friends at Defending Ed. They're a great organization. They do great work. But even this $40 million that has been identified here really is just a small fraction of the total amount of money that these two massive organizations dump into influencing our political system. If you take maybe a little bit broader view and you encapsulate the union's own political activity through their own political action committees, just at the national level, the NEA and the AFT, I think you can get to a number that's about $230 million that's been spent in the most recent fiscal year by these two groups, influencing politics and political debates and giving to progressive aligned nonprofit organizations. And the vast majority of this money is coming out of union dues that are paid by teachers with the understanding that they're getting some assistance in workplace representation, and not, I think, for a few teachers then should recognize just how much of their money is being diverted to the extremely progressive agenda of the two national teachers unions.
Right. I mean, it's hard to see the one-to-one correlation between sending money off to the DNC and helping your average teacher who lives in the Midwest. It seems like a political project going on here. You mentioned the word monopoly, and I think that's very interesting in this because I want you to correct me if I'm wrong here, but my understanding is that there is sort of a government-enforced monopoly, which is to say that teachers' unions give money to Democrats. Those Democrats go and create laws that are favorable to the teachers' unions, like making it harder to leave the teachers' unions or creating narrow opt-out windows or basically creating a situation where it's very difficult for teachers to opt out. There are, in many cases, that when you get a job as a teacher, you're automatically paying dues unless you go out of your way to not pay. So you create this favorable union environment, so the union gets all the money, and then they turn around and give the money back to the Democrats. Is that a fair characterization?
That's absolutely right, Casey. I think it's important to note that there's nothing wrong with teachers' unions inherently, just like there's nothing wrong with any other membership organization. It's part of civil society in America for people to form and join membership organizations to advocate for their shared interests. And there's nothing wrong with teachers doing that. The issue is that many states, not all states, but many states, generally left of center politically, have passed laws that give teachers' unions like the NEA and the AFT incredible privileges under the law. And it looks like a monopoly in two senses. On the one hand, there's a series of policies in places like Illinois, New York, California, and so on that make it difficult for individual teachers to refrain from union membership. But then there's more fundamentally a structure in place in these states that allows a union to get legal recognition under state law as the only entity that can provide workplace representation services to teachers in a particular school district. And so if you're in a state like California, where the vast majority of these school districts have been, the teachers union has been legally certified by the state, then it doesn't matter if the teacher in that district, it doesn't even matter if most of the teachers in that district want to be represented by a different organization or don't want union representation at all. It is extremely difficult under the laws in place for them to get out of that union representation. So it is literally, in a traditional economic sense, these are essentially monopoly organizations that have gotten a legally granted lock on providing a particular service to public sector school teachers in America. There's a few ways around that, but in practice, that's exactly what it looks like. And just like any other monopoly, you see prices go up, higher dues than you would otherwise see. You see competition and accountability go down. And fundamentally, that's the foundation upon which this entire political machine is built. It's built on a coercive monopoly that allows these unions to extract far more than they otherwise would be able to from teachers' paychecks and to plow the excess into advancing their partisan political agenda.
Right, and it varies state by state. I think that's worth pointing out. So some of the money goes nationally, but there's whole state infrastructures and Democratic state parties that are very reliant on these teachers' unions and this kind of symbiotic relationship. But I think the Democrats are in need of this. I want to show this graphic we have of voter registration, and I'll explain it for those listening. But voter registration in all 30 of the states that track Democratic versus Republican voter registration has actually gone down for Democrats. Not a single state are they seeing an improvement in voter registration. And we also have a poll that we just saw from the Wall Street Journal, which shows that Democrats' favorability is at the lowest point that it's been in 3 decades. And so we got about 30 seconds here, Max. I guess they need the money.
They do, but I would just caution people. I think we tend to maybe underestimate the value of these institutions in shaping hearts and minds and in our political debates. And I think what we're seeing is institutions like the NEA and the AFT are so woefully out of step with the views of most Americans and the values of many of their own members that they really do rely on these forced legal monopolies to survive. So it's an area that policymakers should pay close attention to.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. Thanks so much, Max, Director of Research and Government Affairs from the Freedom Foundation. Appreciate you. Coming up, I'll share some good news coming from a federal appeals court which ruled in favor of a physician assistant who was fired from her job for her religious beliefs. You don't want to miss it. We'll unpack that right after the break. Stick around. Download the new Stand Firm app for Apple and Android phones today. You can join a wonderful community of fellow believers. we've created a special place for you to access news from a biblical perspective. Read and listen to daily devotionals, pray for current events, and more. Share the Stand Firm app with your friends, family, and church members. And of course, stand firm wherever you go.
At Family Research Council, defending the family isn't just a mission, it's our daily calling. Every team member at FRC uses their God-given talents to stand for biblical truth, protect life, and uphold religious freedom.
Here at Family Research Council, we face many threats to the family, threats that have been with us for some time. Abortion, the gender ideology threat, the attacks on marriage, the attacks on parental authority, and the attacks on religious freedom. We have to promote, support, strengthen, and incentivize family growth so families take their place in society in a place of honor.
I'm defending the family by working in the Center for Biblical Worldview to provide cutting-edge research and resources for pastors, ministry leaders, and Christian parents.
Through my work at the Washington Stand, I passionately defend what God has defined for marriage and family. I don't see the Washington Stand as just a place to talk about cultural events. It's a place to share biblical truth. It's a perfect outlet to advance and defend what God has defined as good, true, and beautiful.
Because of you, we're able to frame things in such a way that help Christians stand for truth on the things that matter most, like life, faith, family, and freedom.
Thank you for standing with us.
Thank you for your support. It is so critical to the work that we at Family Research Council are doing day to day as we support and strengthen the family. So thank you.
Good afternoon. Welcome back to Washington Watch. I'm Casey Harper, your guest host for today. A physician assistant was fired by a Michigan hospital due to her religious beliefs, and now she's seeking to vindicate her constitutional rights and to protect other healthcare providers from a similar fate. Just this week, she received a favorable ruling from the U.S. Court of Appeals, 6th Circuit, that will allow her lawsuit to proceed. It's kind of technical, but I'm glad we have here Kayla Toney. She's a lawyer with First Liberty Institute, and she's representing the physician assistant. Kayla, welcome to Washington Watch.
Thank you so much for having me.
Sure. So I try to stay out of all the legal minutia in 6th Circuit, 5th Circuit, but this is a really important case. Tell us about your client, Valerie, and what happened exactly, how she got into all this trouble.
Valerie is a wonderful Christian healthcare provider in West Michigan. She's actually the third generation in her family to work at her local clinic. And she worked there for 17 years. She had great relationships with her patients. Some of them were her second generation patients. They all really loved Valerie. And one day everything changed when the University of Michigan Health System took over her local clinic, and they started requiring training that involved LGBTQ plus topics. And at first it was just training, and then it became quizzes where she had to actually affirm statements that went against her faith, statements such as gender is fluid. And this really bothered Valerie because she's a person of deep religious faith. She has a very sensitive conscience, and she knew that she couldn't affirm these statements, and also that having to participate in gender transition treatments would actively harm patients that she deeply cared about. So all she did was she brought it up with her HR department. She asked for a religious accommodation so that she didn't have to check these boxes on the training about gender. And she was attacked. She was called into a meeting with hospital officials whom she had never met. They accused her of being evil and a liar.
Evil.
They told her yes. Wow. They told her she was going to contribute to suicide rates from patients with gender dysphoria. And all this when she had never even had a patient ask her for a referral for some sort of gender transition treatment. And she actually treated patients that were lesbian and gay, and she had good relationships with them. So it was truly a dispute about hypotheticals. But the harm was very real to Valerie because just 3 weeks after that hostile meeting, she was fired.
Wow, being called evil by an industry that sort of mutilates children and makes money off of it is kind of rich. And it always seems there's some Christian minding their own business, just trying to defile their conscience, who's always targeted in these cases. But, my research, I found that Valerie's not the only one. I know there was a teacher in Virginia who got a payout of over $500,000. She refused to use a student's preferred pronoun, and she got fired, and then she sued. And there's other cases like this, but they seem to be going different ways. So how our average viewer or listener here, are they really in danger of being fired from their job from misgendering someone? And are there what legal protections do they have, or is that the whole point of this case?
That is the whole point of this case. It would have been so much easier for Valerie to just move on with her life and try to forget this traumatic incident of her termination, but she did not want this to ever happen again. So that's why she sued in federal court. And so the legal protections that she is suing under and that folks should really all know about. First, there's Title VII, which is a federal law that protects all workers in the United States from discrimination based on religion, also race and age and national origin and other topics, but religion is protected in that statute. And so we claim in court that the hospital violated that law when they fired her because of her religious beliefs. And then also we sued under the free exercise clause of the First Amendment. And this clause protects the ability of religious people in the workplace to say, I don't believe in that. I'm not able to participate. Can you please accommodate me just like you accommodate a lot of other things? And so the argument in a medical setting is, well, there's always healthcare providers that might have a personal objection to, say, examining someone of the opposite sex, or maybe prescribing opioids or certain weight loss drugs, certain narcotics. And so if that's the situation, the schedulers can just place that patient with a different provider. And that actually happened all the time in Valerie's clinic. And so all she was asking for was just an accommodation so that, if a patient wanted to discuss gender transition treatments with her, she would just ask for them to be scheduled in advance with someone that was comfortable prescribing those treatments.
Right. And this is an important point I want to make. Sorry to interrupt you, but this is an important point to make because we saw the same thing with the Christian bakers and florists who were, sued for not baking. It need to be really clear that it's not that they are refusing to serve gay people or refusing to serve transgender people. Valerie was not saying, I'll just get this gay person out of my office or something ridiculous. The florist, the bakers, they would have made cakes and given flowers for any occasion, but they didn't want to make a cake for a gay wedding. And in the same case here, Valerie, she'll do any kind of treatment for a gay or trans person, trans identifying person, but it's the actual treatment. She doesn't want to refer someone for a gender transition surgery. Is that right?
That's right, exactly. And actually a different court, the Eighth Circuit, just recognized that making a referral is actually part of the medical treatment process.
Of course.
So you're not just signing your name. You're saying, with my medical expertise, I'm recommending that this treatment is going to help. And from Valerie's faith and just from her medical judgment, she was concerned that these treatments might actually be harmful. And lo and behold, the Supreme Court agrees with Valerie because just this summer in the ruling United States versus Skermeti, the court upheld some laws that states had passed to actually ban these types of treatments for minors because of the harms and because the medical science and research is just not there to show that transition treatments are actually helpful. And in fact, they often are harmful and they often make some of the struggles even worse. And so Valerie, we feel, has been very vindicated in her concern as a medical professional by that decision from the U.S. Supreme Court this summer.
Right. Well, I think that's a great point you bring up. There's the conscience and religious aspect of this, of saying, I don't want to be a part of this. But then, as a medical provider, you can say, I'm not interested. I don't think this works. Kayla, thanks for explaining. First Liberty Institute. Appreciate you coming on.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me.
Sure. Coming up, we're going to dive into the Wednesday shooting and get to the root issues, mental health, biblical worldview. It's an interesting discussion. Stick around.
Family Research Council is committed to advancing faith, family, and freedom from the East Coast to the West. So FRC is going to Southern California for this year's Pray, Vote, Stand Summit, October 17th and 18th at Calvary Chapel, Chino Hills. Join us for this powerful gathering of Christians desiring cultural renewal and spiritual revival. The Pray, Vote, Stand Summit brings together Christian leaders, issue experts, and government officials for a time of prayer, inspiration, and action. Together, we will seek God's guidance for our nation and engage in meaningful discussions on the intersection of faith, government, and culture. If the spiritual foundations and the cultural walls of our nation are to be rebuilt, we all have a role to play. May we each find our place on the wall as we build for biblical truth. Register now at PrayVoteStand.org. That's PrayVoteStand.org.
Jennifer. It's so exciting to be here with you today talking about our new book, Embracing God's Design. Who is actually going to benefit from reading this book in your view?
There's so many different audiences that can benefit. The first one are counselors themselves, right? Because we have some material in there where we really address the gender dysphoria diagnosis and what is wrong with it. We have information for people who are wanting to go back to embracing God's design for their life.
This is really magical to have the therapist and the individual who suffered come together and write about why this is happening and why we're seeing this.
And we brought all of that experience to the table. We want to see people walking in the fullness of who God has called them to be and not a false identity.
Order today at embracethedesign.com.
How should Christians think about the thorny issues shaping our culture? How should Christians address deceitful ideas like transgenderism, critical theory, or assisted suicide? How can Christians navigate raising children in a broken culture, the war on gender roles, or rebuilding our once great nation? Outstanding is a podcast from the Washington Stand dedicated to these critical conversations. Outstanding seeks to tear down what our corrupt culture lifts up with an aim to take every thought and every idea captive to the obedience of Christ. Whether policies or partisan politics, whether conflict in America or conflict abroad, join us and our guests as we examine the headlines through the lens of Scripture and explore how Christians can faithfully exalt Christ in all of life. Follow Outstanding on your favorite podcast app and look for new episodes each week.
Good afternoon. Welcome back to Washington Watch. I'm Casey Harper, your guest host for today. Just a quick reminder, our Pray, Vote, Stand Summit is taking place October 17th through the 18th in Chino Hills, California. To learn more and to register, visit prayvotestand.org. That's prayvotestand.org. Now, since Wednesday, we've been discussing extensively the tragic attack on a Catholic church in Minneapolis during a service to mark the first week of school. As with so many of the other mass shootings in recent years, legacy media has been burying a key element of the story. That many of these shooters had mental health issues, including gender confusion. Well, the Trump administration says it plans to address the root causes of violence.
This happens too much in our country. And if you look, we really do have, I think, a mental health crisis in the United States of America. We take way more psychiatric medication than any other nation on earth. And I think it's time for us to start asking some very hard questions about the root causes of this violence.
That was Vice President J.D. Vance yesterday. Also yesterday, Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said his department is launching studies on how psychiatric drugs might be contributing to violence. Are these all steps in the right direction? Well, joining me to discuss this now is Sheila Matthews, the co-founder of ablechild.org. Sheila, welcome to Washington Watch.
Thank you so much, Casey, for having Able Child on. We really appreciate it.
Well, it's an honor to have you. I think people are fascinated by this topic right now. It comes up cyclically, and I think we've got to start digging into the root issues to try to get to the bottom of this. In that spirit, what can you tell us about the mental health issues surrounding some of these school shooters? I mean, I don't want to make too much of it, but it does seem many of the violent shooters have identified as transgender or gender fluid as part of their identity.
Well, we have a long history at Able Child investigating, unfortunately, these mass killings, and we started with Sandy Hook. Now, Adam Lanza was not a transgender, but what he was a mental health patient that was seeking mental health treatments, and he was on a cocktail of psychiatric drugs that have never been tested together, like the makers of makers of one psychiatric drug and another psychiatric drug do not cross-test these drugs. So the mass killings that we've worked on throughout the country have been associated with psychiatric drugs. Now, the trending issue of these young men that have been lied to and told that they can somehow be a woman or vice versa is, again, under the umbrella of psychiatry. So they're in charge, really, of the policies throughout the country, the mental health providers. In each state, there's committees that make these decisions. And so they're supporting this lie to our children that they can become a different sex. So that really falls under the umbrella of mental health. So the introduction of these gender-affirming drugs are a combination, what we're finding, like with Audrey Hale in Tennessee, is that she was on a combination of psychiatric drugs that were first started and then the gender drugs of the hormones. So the combination has never been tested. So this is human research. That's what this is.
Yeah, I mean, we are seeing, what you're telling me is we're seeing living experiments of combining these cocktails of drugs. And I really feel a lot of compassion for people who need either, feel they need the transgender treatment, as it's called, or the SSRIs and related medication. People don't get to that point without being in a lot of pain on either issue. At the same time, the transgender science isn't very new and in some cases non-existent, or there's evidence that the treatments, quote unquote treatments that we're using don't really help people. And then I think even the SSRIs and other psychiatric medications, they have a lot of side effects often, and we don't have 100-year studies on how some of these things affect people. So am I mischaracterizing this, or do you think, what's the answer? Do we just need to study how these work together? Do we even have any research on that at all?
No, there is no science behind psychiatric diagnosing. So ADHD and bipolar, this was voted in by psychiatry. There's no blood test, there's no brain scan, there's no way to determine whether a child has ADHD or bipolar. It's a marketing effort, a combination between the psychiatric and pharmaceutical companies. So right from the beginning, we're talking, what is the science? These are symptoms. And I agree with you. I have a great deal of sympathy for children that are suffering from attention issues or sexual issues. We're talking about puberty. And, all human beings go through a transition of puberty and trying to figure out your own identity as a person. But what the psychiatric industry has done is marketed this to become sellable to parents. And this is the science that really needs to be questioned. So there's no way to determine whether this medical model we've been using for 30 years of diagnosing with these false labels and then drugging our children has helped them in any way. So the model itself is very flawed, and the industry has pushed out anybody in their own industry that has disagreed with this medical model that has been tied to the pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to what you're saying there. And to me, what it comes down to, as you pointed, there's no blood test for a lot of these. So it's based on the judgment of a doctor who's evaluating. And of course, there's schooling and education. But when the entire community, the medical community in that field, has departed from a basic understanding of human nature, I think they can get into trouble and say, what do I mean by that? Well, if you don't know the difference between the two genders, or that there are only two, maybe you don't understand human nature well enough to prescribe. Or if you don't know that, hey, little boys are just not going to want to sit still and you need to drug them. I mean, I think what it keeps coming back to here is a misunderstanding of human nature, because we've adopted a lot of modern psychiatric theories. Final word here, Sheila.
Well, the industry itself is totally unregulated. They're writing their own legislation. Parent advocates like Able Child, human rights organizations are not allowed into at the table. President Trump said that parents would have a seat at the table. We want that seat. We want human rights in mental health. We want informed consent. We want parents to be told that there is no more than two genders. You cannot cannot convert your child from a boy to a girl or a girl to a boy. That science isn't there. It's insulting. It's a human rights violation. And the actual psychiatric diagnosing of children in schools, it is a billion-dollar business, and we need a voice at the table. So we're grateful for Secretary Kennedy that he has now launched this investigation into SSRIs and mass killings. We've been asking for that. We have a petition on our website that people can sign. I really urge your listeners to do that because we need 10,000 signatures to present to the president. And we have about 3,500 right now. We don't have the same platform as the pharmaceutical industries do. What we want is informed consent. We want you to be able to choose your own type of mental health, but we want real science and real informed consent.
Well, Sheila Matthews, I appreciate you coming on, making a lot of great points. Kind of a dark picture, but sadly, I think there's a lot of truth in it. Co-founder of ablechild.org. Sheila, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. You know, it's interesting. Genesis says that God made us male and female, and there's so much debate in the world over that today, but it's not just a biblical perspective to back this up. Interesting theme of this program is, as we should expect, science is backing up God's word, and over time we're seeing more and more research to say, hey, maybe Genesis was right about male and female. After all, shouldn't surprise us, and it's always good to see. But I want to continue this discussion about the shooting on Wednesday as we head into this biblical worldview segment. And I actually have joining me now is David Clausen to do that, the director of the Center for Biblical Worldview here at the Family Research Council. By the way, he's the author of Life After Roe, Equipping Christians in the Fight for Life Today. David, thanks for joining us today.
Happy Friday. Great to be with you as always, Casey.
Absolutely. Happy Friday indeed, but not a happy Wednesday, and really a kind of a grim week in America. I want to get your response to this tragedy. The news is talking about it every day. It's really touched me personally because we have kids involved here, David.
Yeah, Casey, my first response is what you just said. It's grief and lament. And I don't just come at this as someone who thinks about public policy or even as a Christian or someone involved in Christian ministry. You know, I now come to a kind of a topic like this as a father now. And it's just unimaginable what those families who are affected, the two victims, 8 and 10 years old, another 15 victims, ages 6 through 15. It's a reminder what Jeremiah says in chapter 17, verse 9. The heart is deceitful above all things, and when sin takes root, it can have devastating effects. But I think I look at this with a pastoral response, wanting to grieve with those who grieve, but also recognizing kind of a biblical response that apart from Christ, the human heart really is capable of great evil.
Yeah, I mean, it's so true, and we're seeing that. I think we're in a spiritual war, and sometimes we forget that, and then it pops back in our face in a really stark way. One thing I want to ask you about is pretty much immediately after this happened, a sadly predictable trend played out where politicians sought to politicize the tragedy by talking about guns. I mean, we can have a conversation there. But what was also interesting was to see how immediately so many, particularly on the left, decided to attack prayer. For instance, we have a former White House press secretary, Jen Psaki, and she put out this tweet, got a lot of pushback. She said, prayer is not freaking enough. Prayer does not end school shootings, and, enough with the thoughts and prayers. And so, her sentiment, though, was echoed by a lot of people. I'm reminded of what Jesus said, that out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. Why is it so many on the left are upset about prayer instead of some of the root causes of these shootings, David?
Yeah, Casey, I think those comments and others that I've heard like them, well, first, they reveal a deep misunderstanding of what Christians mean when we talk about prayer. Prayer is not a throwaway gesture. I think many on the left, coming from a secular humanistic worldview, kind of look at prayer kind of as just an empty thought, an empty gesture. As Christians, we have a theology of prayer. I'm thinking of James chapter 5, verse 16. It says the prayer of a righteous person has power in its working. As Christians, Jesus taught us how to pray. Of course, prayer does not undo a tragedy, but it does connect us to God, who can comfort, who can provide healing, who can change hearts. So I don't think real solutions are ever going to come when you dismiss God. From a Christian worldview, real solutions are only going to come when we turn to him, actually. I don't think prayer and action are opposites. As Christians, we're called to pray and we're called to work. Ephesians 2:10, we're the people who do good. And so again, I just think it reveals a misunderstanding in prayer, but it is a response that a culture is going to have that has long been disconnected from a biblical worldview.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's a purposeful misunderstanding, though, I think, because their hearts, I think, of so many people now, especially on the left, have become hostile to Christianity, to the church. They think at best it's sort of like a mild-mannered moralism, and at worst it's a vehicle for a worldview that they really hate, a biblical worldview. And so when people talk about prayer and they're high in emotion, what they really believe about the church and about the Bible and about God kind of spills out. And I won't speak for any individual's heart, because it's not just Jen Psaki, it's a lot of people saying this kinds of things. But I think it reveals sort of the worldview on the left, which maybe 30 years ago, even if Republicans and Democrats disagreed, there was a general respect for prayer, a general respect for the Bible, a general respect for God. But I think we've departed from that. I want to switch gears briefly and talk about this Cracker Barrel story, David. At first, I wanted to not talk about this. I have to be honest, because I love Cracker Barrel. I love biscuits and gravy. And you may, if you're watching, it's very obvious that I love biscuits and gravy by, what I'm carrying around, this weight here. But I grew up in Texas, and it was just part of it, and I love it, and I love Cracker Barrel. And, they changed their logo, of course, which got a lot of attention. I think you're not on the internet if you didn't see the new logo. They removed the man, they removed the older man and the barrel, and they have this sort of modern, hip logo. And it feels kind of bland, it feels kind of millennial, but I didn't want to attack them over that. But then it came out that they are doing all kinds of DEI and LGBT things all this time while having a conservative customer base. We got about 2 minutes left. What's going on with Cracker Barrel, David?
Yeah, I think what was revealed, and I share your sentiment, Casey. Again, I like the old logo, but it's not something that I was going to lose sleep over. But kind of as people have gotten under the hood, we've seen kind of this commitment to DEI and woke ideology, as well as significant LGBT activism. And I think, so I'm glad a lot of this has been unearthed. And again, just very briefly, I think, what we've realized is these ideas might dominate the boardroom. And clearly they do dominate the boardrooms of many corporate organizations, including places that kind of view themselves as family friendly. But, Casey, these values do not resonate with the values of everyday people. And we've seen this time and time again, whether it was Target, Bud Light a couple of years ago, that when these this ideology is unearthed, your rank and file average Americans do not like it. And I think companies need to realize you go woke, you go broke, as the saying goes. But again, I kudos to Christians for using kind of their collective power. And we talked about this last week, kind of the principled stewardship.
Right.
And so I welcome this development.
Yeah, I think that's right. I love the boardroom. It may resonate in the boardroom, in some high rise, but maybe not the living room of the average American home. David Clausen, director of the Center for Biblical Worldview here at Family Research Council. Thanks so much for coming on.
God bless. Thank you, Casey.
Absolutely. Well, that's our show. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been an honor. It's been a joy. We're back next week. Joshua chapter 1, verse 9 says, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." Do you believe it? You should. It's true. Stay strong.
Washington Watch with Tony Perkins is brought to you by Family Research Council and is entirely listener-supported. Portions of the show discussing candidates are brought to you by Family Research Council Action. For more information on anything you heard today, or to find out how you can partner with us in our ongoing efforts to promote faith, family, and freedom, visit TonyPerkins.com.